I'm going to talk to you today about American history, U.S. history. This is Dr. Shin's idea. I think I'm going to tell you about the things I think you should know that any student, American or foreign student, should know about American history. If you, as Koreans, can learn this material, and if you then go to the States, or if you plan to go to the States, I think if you learn this material, you will be in very good condition, better condition than most American students. So I hope this is helpful to you. It's best to remember a few things. First of all, dates. Most students are very weak on dates. American students, and I suspect Korean students too. You have to know dates. I realize that this is perhaps boring, pedestrian. Try that one out. Pedestrian. But the student who doesn't know dates will make very ignorant statements, will make claims that simply cannot be backed up, say absurd things that are historically impossible. The student who knows dates has a framework within which to work, will understand structure, and then can make statements based on some knowledge. So you must remember dates. I'm going to give you maybe a lot of dates. Not all dates. How many dates? I don't know. We'll see. 30 dates. If you remember even 20 of them, you'll be okay. Better than Americans. Okay, to begin. It's best to discuss the history of anything, I think, by dividing it into periods. And already we come to dates. But if you can remember just these periods, and a few presidents and a few wars, because that's what a lot of history is, presidents and wars, then you'll be also in pretty good shape. Okay. The first period we will call pre-Columbian. Columbus, Columbian. Pre, before. That is from prehistoric times up to 1492. 1492, the date of Columbus. Now, in North America, this is the history of Indian tribes in U.S. territories, specifically American Indian tribes. I don't know much about these things, and I think probably most historians don't know very much. But you should know that various tribes formed almost empires, had almost empires in the United States territories. For example, in the east, the Iroquois nation formed a kind of empire. Navajo in the southwest, and Cherokee here and there, and Seminole, and so forth. If you're familiar with some of these names, that's good. I urge you to be familiar with 3 or 4. Iroquois, Cherokee in the south, Navajo in the southwest, and maybe Apache. All of these appear in cowboy movies, and they're not hard to remember. What is hard to remember are the differences that separate these tribes, but I don't know them myself very much. Some out on the plains, like Apaches, were great horsemen, riders of horses. Others who lived in other places did not rely so much on horses, of course, and so forth and so on. Okay, now, the big date, of course, is 1492. In 1492, Columbus, an Italian, sailed from Spain with the support of the Queen of Spain, sailed 3 ships, sailing westward. His aim, his goal, was to land in the Indies, or India, to get at the riches of especially India. That was the reason why the Queen financed this venture, and so forth. Very bold, he deserves to be famous for his boldness, for his courage, his vision perhaps. He landed on islands. He really did not land on continental North America. He landed on islands not far from Florida. His attitude toward the new lands was really the Spanish attitude generally for 200 years. And the Spanish attitude was really not very praiseworthy. The Spaniards wanted, number one, gold. They were driven by gold. They wanted slaves. They really did not want to stay in the New World. Some eventually did stay, but in Mexico, of course, in South America, Central America. But their attitude was not very nice. They were not agricultural. They were not interested in agriculture. The Spaniards were riders, great horsemen. They loved to ride the plains, and they looked for gold, gold, gold. And this was really Columbus's attitude too. So that recently, in October, on Columbus Day, which we Americans still celebrate, these things are very political, and you should be aware of that. Columbus Day exists because we have many Italian Americans, Italo-Americans. If we did not have so many Italo-Americans, we would not have Columbus Day. Is Columbus a hero? Yes and no. Not a very nice man, in a way. He exploited the people whom he found, of course. The white man generally did that, but the Spaniards, I think, everything I know about the Spaniards, well, let's hesitate on that. The Spaniards fall into two groups. On the one hand, the conquistadors. These were the conquerors. These were the men who wanted gold and, okay, slaves. They exploited everything they found. And the ones who stayed owned vast areas of land in the Southwest, in California, and of course in Mexico. The other group were the monks, the Catholic missionaries. Many of these were excellent human beings, as generally true. Their aim was to, of course, teach Christianity and save the souls of the aborigines, the natives. But many of them were very good, kindly, saintly people too. And so it's wrong to generalize entirely about the Spaniards. Okay, some of these conquistadores, conquerors, I don't remember most of them myself, but De Soto, of course in Mexico, Cortez, in South America, Pizarro. These were, I think, cruel, cruel men. The ones inside the United States, oh Lord, I meant to look these up today, but who was the one who was looking for the fountain of youth? De Soto, I can only think of De Soto. I'm sorry, I'll think of other names later. But let's move on. Now, so much for pre-Columbian and post-Columbian, because we're now in the second period, the age of exploration and conquest. Just in case I've lost you. The first period was pre-Columbian, Indians. Second period, exploration, explore, and conquest, conquer, especially the Spaniards. Now the English came first in 1607. 1607 is a big date. Second big date. First big one, 1492. Second one, 1607. That's the date of the Jamestown settlement in Virginia. It didn't last very long. At the end of one winter, the 108 or so people there died. No one quite knows how they died. Killed by the Indians? Don't know. But at least the English had made a try, an attempt. The second big one is a very big date, 1620. 1620 is the date of the so-called Pilgrims. The Pilgrims are interesting people, and I have to give you some historical background about them. These are people, as the English generally were people, who came to the new land, to the new world, North America, the new world, looking for religious freedom and some for a new start, adventure, but a new start, a new beginning in life. These are people who came and planned to stay, to build lives for their families, to establish colonies for England is true, but especially their interest was religious freedom. And that's the case of the Pilgrims. Now, in order to understand the Pilgrims, you need some background. You need to know, as you generally need to know, even those of you who are Christians, need to know about the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation, huge date, begins 1517. 1517 in Germany, in Wittenberg, Germany, was the time, October I think, when Martin Luther, who was a Catholic monk, an Augustinian monk, and a scholar, he was Dr. Martin Luther. Martin Luther nailed up a list of 95 theses, Theses, as he called them. 95 questions, really, which he was offering to discuss and debate upon. Really, it wasn't a list directly of things that he was angry at the Catholic Church, his church, about, but rather things that could be discussed, or at least that was the tradition of theses. But many of these matters were things which he was angry about, and generally German Catholics were angry about. And so immediately many Germans responded to this list, this protest by Martin Luther, because they were angry at the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, though, had needed to be reformed for hundreds of years, at least 300 years. And for 300 years they had talked about reform and had made half-hearted attempts to reform themselves, that is, to reform itself, the Catholic Church. When Luther started what would be the Protestant Reformation, this meant a split in the Church. The reason for this, one reason, was German nationalism. Germans were tired of domination by the Italians, by the Church, and that's one reason why German aristocrats, lords, supported Luther, at least in northern Germany. They wanted a break from Catholic Italy. Okay, back to our people. The Protestant Reformation then spread many places, but let's say another famous leader of the Protestants was John Calvin. John Calvin was a Frenchman, but he established a Protestant community in Geneva, Switzerland, and thousands of Frenchmen became Protestants too. In Geneva, where Calvin was really centered, his power was absolute. Now, a follower of Calvin, try to follow this: Luther, Calvin, John Knox, K-N-O-X. John Knox took Calvinism to Scotland, and Scotland became Calvinist. The Scots became Calvinist Protestants. Now, in England, the Protestant Reformation was begun by King Henry VIII. I won't tell his whole story, although it's very interesting. But England, King Henry VIII established the Church of England in 1534. The Church of England headed by the king, was still Catholic in many ways, but also became Protestant in many ways too. Now we're ready to understand. Knox in Scotland, Knox's Calvinism came to England, and certain elements of the English population preferred Calvinism to Church of England Protestantism. Sorry. Among these people, these Protestants in England who were Calvinists, among these people were the Puritans. The Puritans were very Protestant. They were impatient with the Church of England. And they were not popular with the Church of England. So that after a while, the king, first Henry VIII, and then Edward, his son, Edward VII, and then even Queen Elizabeth, persecuted these Puritans sometimes. The Puritans fled to Holland, because Holland, Netherlands, offered almost complete religious freedom. So the Puritans went to Holland, but from Holland they went to the New World. They weren't happy in Holland. They wanted their own land. So the Puritans, these Puritans, went from England to Holland to the New World. These were our Pilgrims. So the Pilgrims were radical Protestants who were looking for religious freedom and landed in 1620 in Massachusetts. Their power became very great in Massachusetts. They dominated Massachusetts. And so 1620 is a big date. And all of you know about our Thanksgiving, next week in fact. Thanksgiving is a national holiday, not a religious holiday, by the way. It's a state holiday. National holiday to celebrate, give thanks, like your Chuseok, but give thanks for the Pilgrims' survival of that first winter. That's what that holiday is really meant to commemorate. Okay, now we're ready. Gradually then, the British, especially the British settlers, came to the northeast coast, that is the east coast of United States now, and they settled from Maine to South Carolina, to Georgia. The colonies grew, more and more people came. They had problems, of course, but some became very prosperous, especially Massachusetts, Boston grew, and especially New York City grew, and the state of New York became more and more prosperous. Actually, it was Dutch at first. The Dutch settled there, but England gradually took over. Pennsylvania was settled by the Quakers, another religious group, Protestants. They grew and prospered. So the colonies, as they came to be known, grew quickly. The population grew, the economy grew, trade among the colonies and between the colonies and England especially grew more and more. This was very profitable to England, and it was profitable to the colonists. Now there were 13 colonies, and we are now in our third period. First period, pre-Columbian. Second period, exploration and conquest. Third period, colonial period. Colony, colonial. There were 13 colonies, 13 states we would call them, but at that time they were colonies, and they belonged to England. England controlled them, English law governed them, they paid taxes to England, and this was a problem more and more. and they owed their loyalty, their allegiance to the King of England and England. They were English citizens. Okay. In the colonial period, though, problems grew. Some good things, some bad things happened. The one war that we were involved in, the colonies were involved in, was the French Indian War. In Europe, this war was called the 7 Years' War. I think the dates, I meant to check, 1756, 1763, I think. Check me on that, but it sounds right. 7 Years' War in Europe, but in the colonies it was called the French Indian War. This was a war between England and France. In Europe, other countries were involved. Spain was involved, Holland was involved, but not, of course, in North America. Now, the French were in Canada, and the French had also settled as traders in many of the northernmost states, Maine, Michigan, Wisconsin, even Minnesota, Ohio even, and Illinois. But the French did not settle with families. Their attitude was a little like the Spaniards. That is, like that of the Spaniards. That is, they were there to make money and take the money back to Europe. They were not there to settle, really. Now, it's true that in Canada, more and more French families came, and they settled there, Quebec, and stayed. These especially were French Protestants. They were looking for religious freedom, too. That's why they came. Excuse me. But French Catholics, not so much. Why would they leave France? French Protestants, yes. Especially after 1688, when Louis XIV took away their rights, the French Huguenots, as they're called, French Protestants. Thousands left France at that time. A big date in French history. But we're in North America. So the French Indian War broke out. The colonists, British subjects, naturally fought for England against France. The Indians' role in this war was basically the Indians preferred the French rather than the British for very good reasons. The French didn't bother them much. The French trappers, hunters, trappers looking for furs, made friends with the Indians. The Indians helped them. The British bothered the Indians a lot. The Indians had no reason to like the British, and they didn't have much reason to like us Americans either, and never have had a reason for that matter, and never will. But that's okay. Okay, so that war was interesting. I have not seen the film The Patriot, but some of you have, Mel Gibson. In that film, Mel Gibson, I know the story a little bit. Mel Gibson was a hero. Very good. In The Patriot, Mel Gibson plays a man who was a hero during the French Indian War, fighting for the British, an American. But when the American Revolution came up, he didn't really want to fight against the British. Many Americans didn't. They considered themselves British citizens, loyal to the king. But then a terrible thing happens, and he becomes a fighter for the Revolutionary Army against the British. Anyway, French Indian War. From an American point of view, the best thing that happened during that war was that some American men gained experience in war. And George Washington was one of these. He was a hero for the British against the French and the Indians during the French Indian War. And because he gained so much experience, and other men did too, they were able to fight in 1775 and thereafter for independence, because that's what's coming up. Now, more and more American citizens disliked the British. They didn't like paying taxes to the king far away. They didn't like it when British soldiers came, and where were the soldiers going to stay? Well, they stayed in the homes of American citizens. Would you like that? I don't think so. The Americans didn't like it either. and more, really, they didn't like the fact that some of their money went to the British. They wanted independence so that they could keep their own money. And they wanted to establish a country, the United States. And the intellectuals, the thinkers among them, wanted to establish a true democracy, not a kingdom, a constitutional monarchy, which England is, a constitutional monarchy, monarch king, no king. They wanted a full democracy. So these various reasons. One, economic reasons. This is what's happening now. We're preparing for the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War. One, economic reasons. Many Americans wanted independence because they thought that they could lead more prosperous lives in their own country rather than paying taxes to England, and rather than obeying English laws too. Two, many Americans wanted to establish a true democracy, the first true democracy in the world, at least since Athens, ancient Athens, 5th century BC Athens. Democracy was in the air in Europe at this time, the age of the Enlightenment, late 18th century. Many people were talking about democracy. This was not okay. So the intellectuals, the thinkers, wanted to establish a true democracy. They realized that they had a great opportunity. This vast continent could become a testing ground for true democracy. And so these men were radicals. They were political radicals. And they were very courageous thinkers and men of action too. Remarkable people, really. The best Americans, probably. Anyway, so more and more tension, more and more conflicts with England, fights over tea taxes, fights over quartering of troops, that is, forcing people to lodge British troops in their homes, fights over many things. And then finally came 1775. Now we're ready for the third big period, fourth period actually, the Revolutionary War. Reviewing. First, pre-Columbian. Second, exploration and conquest. Third, colonial period. I'm skipping many things among the colonial periods, but many things have been mentioned. The 13 colonies. You want to remember that, though. 13 colonies. And during the colonial period, the French-Indian War, 1756, 1763. Fourth, the American Revolution and the Revolutionary War. The first fighting began in 1775 in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts from the start was the leader, really, of the Revolutionary War. I'd say Massachusetts and Virginia emerged as the two leading states, colonies, states now, during the war. They had the most money, they produced the greatest leaders, they produced the thinkers, they were the leaders. Okay, 1775. The fighting began. Then in 1776, huge date, 1776, representatives from each of the colonies met in Philadelphia, and they wrote, really Thomas Jefferson did most of the writing, Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, they wrote the Declaration of Independence. Well, this and the Constitution, these are the two most important documents in American history. The Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. Huge date. The Declaration of Independence declared that the colonies wanted independence, were going to fight for independence, listed some of their grievances, good word, grievances, that is, the things that they were not happy about, the reasons why they were fighting. 1776, July 4th. Our July 4th holiday celebrates that event. It celebrates the Declaration of Independence. Not generally the war, the Declaration of Independence, that remarkable document. Okay, the war was now in full swing. Very complicated. It lasted really from 1775 until 1783. That's a long time, 8 years. In effect, it had ended by 1781, but even that's a long time. The courage of the Americans, of the colonists, deserves a lot of credit. The fact these people made great sacrifices. It was not easy going. Many people don't know much about this, but of course there were even rebellions. That is, the troops, the American troops, mutinied, rebelled against their leaders, against their own leaders, killed their officers sometimes. And so Washington or somebody had to send troops to establish order and punish the people who rebelled against their own leaders, Americans. Second, they were loyalists. Mel Gibson was one in that movie, that is, people who did not want to break with England. And there were thousands of these people. They did not support the war for independence. They didn't trust the American rebels. They thought they were just greedy men who simply wanted to break from England to make more money. So, of course, this was not a pretty war. Nothing pretty about it, actually. Brutal war. But how did we win? How did we win against the best army in the world? Because England was the best army in the world at the time. I think everyone would admit that. Prussia may be an exception, but England's army was a great army. I think we won for several reasons. First of all, it was so expensive for England to actually conduct this war from thousands of miles away. More and more, as the war dragged on, more and more, the British people were wondering, why are we fighting this war? It costs too much. We have other problems. We always worry about France. Let them go. They're all rabble anyway, they probably thought. Rabble means low life, uncivilized barbarians. Let them go. They're stupid Puritans and stupid hotheads and convicts. Poor rabble. Let them go. That's the second reason why we won. It was so expensive for the British, and the British population became more and more disgusted by the war. The third reason is probably the support of France. Now, why did France support us? That's an interesting question. I think probably the King of France supported us just to, how shall we say, to spite England. They saw a chance to cause trouble for England, and they took it. They sent troops, they sent ships, they sent supplies, they sent weapons, they sent generals. Without the French, we would not have won. Absolutely not. Some Germans supported us too. The Hessians from Hessen, where Frankfurt is. Some Prussians even too. So without foreign support, we never would have won. Now, the most famous battle, I think, of the Revolutionary War came in 1781. That was the Battle of Yorktown, Virginia. An amazing thing. Washington, just amazing that he was able to lead his troops from a great distance, up, I think in Massachusetts really, a great distance down to Virginia, and the British did not know they were coming, at least from New Jersey. Lord Cornwallis was the British leader, a great general himself, but the French sent their ships. They outnumbered and blocked the British ships, and eventually we surrounded the British. They had no chance of escape. 8,000 men surrendered. The war was over. Late 1781. The peace process lasted for 2 more years, but the war really had ended in 1781 at the Battle of Yorktown. So if you know that name, that date, you know about it already. The most famous name of a Frenchman who supported us was Lafayette, an amazing man, a great man, who later became a kind of hero in the French Revolution also. A remarkable man. Anyway, by 1783, we officially had our independence. The colonies were tired really of each other by then. Each colony wanted to live in peace and not be bothered by anyone else. So they formed a kind of Articles of Federation is what it's called, like a constitution, but it made the colonies a loose group of colonies who would only unite if there were a war. No taxes, no president, no army, no leaders, no laws, and it didn't work. 3 years later, in 1787, the colonies sent representatives to New York, I think mostly, where they met and they made a constitution. And the Constitution is the other most important document in American history. The Constitution really is the most important document in American history. It's a remarkable document, the envy of the world, I think. If not, it should be. The best Constitution that's ever been made, I think. The model for other countries at very least. And the makers of it deserve great praise. They are our founding fathers. Jefferson again, Ben Franklin again, James Madison again, Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton again, George Washington had a hand in it too. The document was complete by 1788, and then in 1789 they added the first 10 amendments, really. And those 10 amendments form our Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, the single most important part of our Constitution, guarantee Americans freedoms. And really, it's the first Bill of Rights, the first of those Bill of Rights, or amendment, that's the single most important, guaranteeing us freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religious choice, association, all packed into the first amendment, as it's called, of those 10 amendments that are called the Bill of Rights. In 1789, we had our first election, but everyone knew who would be our first president, George Washington. Who would question that? No one questioned that. The man was a god. Many Americans, though, did not trust this idea of democracy. Many Americans wanted him to be our first king, and wanted him to be treated as a king. And if he had wanted to be a king, he could have. One of the greatest things about the man was the fact that he refused that. He believed in democracy too. But his influence, his power, really, his popularity was vast. He was our first president. Already he was tired. He wanted to go home to his home, Mount Vernon, Virginia. He was a Virginian. But he led the country during the first 8 years. He served 2 terms as president, 4 years and 4 years. And he could have served longer but didn't want to. And because of that, we had the tradition that no one should serve longer than 2 terms, 8 years. It was because Washington didn't. And I think rightly so. There has been one exception in our history, but we'll deal with that later. So, the great importance of Washington's 8 years is that during these years we gained some stability. We got used to our Constitution, we formed a government, our capital moved around from Philadelphia to Boston to New York. But toward the end of these years, we decided to build a capital in Washington, D.C. The idea was somewhere between the northern states and the southern states. Washington, D.C. Washington served his 8 years. Fortunately, we had no wars during that time, because if we had had war, I think it would have been a disaster, but we didn't. Then came John Adams, who served from 1797 to 1801, 4 years. Not very popular man, but a good man and a thinker. Then came Jefferson. Now, how much of this should you remember? I think you should remember the date of the Constitution, 1788-89, really. The dates of Washington's presidency, 89 to 93, 93 to 97, John Adams, 97 to 1801, and Jefferson, the first 3 presidents. Then the next don't matter much. Jefferson was president for 8 years too. You have to know something about Jefferson. Now, the issue that was emerging during these early years was the issue that is still a big issue in America. And the issue really is federal control, meaning the power in the hands of a national government in some capital, Washington, D.C., or state control. Federal control, centralized government, or state control, local power. This would be the issue that was behind the Civil War. It's still an issue. Generally, the Democrats, the Democratic Party today, supports federal control, federal regulation. The belief is the big government in Washington has to control the country, because if they don't, then local greedy people will have too much control. So generally, the Democratic Party believes in a strong federal government, a centralized government, which will protect the little man, because the Democratic Party, by tradition, is the party of the little man, not big business, the little man. And the belief is that only the government can protect us against the vested interests of big business and even big state government, local government. That's a big statement. Now, the opposite of this in early times was not the Republican Party, because the Republican Party didn't begin until about 1856, around there, the 1850s. The opposite was the Jeffersonian Party, let's say, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson didn't trust big government, didn't trust centralized government. He supported state government. Generally, he was a farmer, and agriculture doesn't trust big government far away. Agriculture likes local government, local traditions even. Now, here was Jefferson, our president, from 1801 to 1809. Big, important years. The biggest date for our purposes is 1803, the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson purchased a huge amount of land that begins from Louisiana and stretches all the way to the state of Washington, diagonally, from the French government, from Napoleon. Napoleon needed money. Jefferson saw this opportunity to double our territory. Many people did not like this at all, but he did it anyway, in a very un-Jeffersonian way. After all, this was a big decision by federal government, by a president really, to spend a lot of money, though really it wasn't so much, to double our territory. He did it. And most people think it's the best thing he ever did. Suddenly, the whole idea of what the United States would be changed completely. From some colonies crouched against the East Coast to a country that was going to become a huge country that would stretch all the way to the Pacific. Jefferson made that happen, really, in one moment, almost. 1803, Louisiana Purchase. Okay, we can skip many things from then on. We have the War of 1812 against the British. The British burned Washington, D.C., but eventually they got tired of that war because really the War of 1812 was part of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon and England and Russia, especially. And so we were lucky to get out of that war. The biggest thing that happened during that war, I think, was that we decided that we needed a navy. And from then on, we developed a navy, which more and more challenged the British and eventually passed the British. Huge navy, and we needed it because we were growing. I would emphasize Jackson, Andrew Jackson, Jacksonian democracy. Andrew Jackson was from Tennessee. He was our president from 1829 to 1837, 8 years. He was a great man, I think. And his idea of democracy, Jacksonian democracy, was that the common man should have more and more part in the government. After all, originally the only people who could vote were people who were white, of course, who were males, of course, and who owned land. More and more the individual states changed that and did away with the land requirement, gradually did away with other requirements too. This meant that more and more American democracy was a democracy of the common man. This was a big gesture because this meant we had to trust the common man. Trust that the common man would make the right decisions. Trust that the common man could understand problems and issues and make rational decisions. Big idea. No other country believed that. No other country believed it at all. England, at the same time, really was expanding its idea of the vote, enfranchisement. Enfranchising people means giving people the vote. England was spreading its giving the right to vote to more and more people. France was true, in fairness. But America led the way in this, and really Andrew Jackson led the way in this. Okay, the next big thing, I think, is the Mexican, 1844, Texas. Texas won independence from Mexico by itself. We were not directly involved, but Americans had settled in Texas, and by a miracle, by a lot of courage and a lot of determination, these Texans won independence from Mexico. In 1844, they established the Republic of Texas. This is good to know because George Bush is a Texan. And the Texans are a little bit different. Sometimes they think they have their own country, I think. In the past, this was true. Anyway, soon after that, though, they wanted to become part of the USA. That was the plan all along. And they were admitted to the states. But more and more, the big problem that was occurring was, would Texas, would any new state, because there were more and more new states, would the state be a pro-slavery state or a free state? Because the issue of slavery was becoming bigger and bigger. Frankly, it was an issue even at the start. Even at the start, a man like Ben Franklin could not tolerate an idea like slavery. incredibly, a man like Jefferson did, and Washington did. They had slaves, thousands of slaves even. So this was an issue that was a problem even at the beginning of American history, and it just became a bigger and bigger problem. But behind the issue of slavery was the issue of states' rights. That is, does that big government in Washington have the right to tell us that we can't have slaves? The right to own slaves was guaranteed even in the Constitution, originally. So, can the states decide about such things, or can Washington decide? The northern states were richer, had larger populations, and therefore had more power, in some ways at least. In the House of Representatives, I won't get into the structure of American government, but I will sometime. So the southern states were more and more in a defensive position, and the northern states were more and more attacking the South for its slavery. The abolitionist movement in the North became more and more influential. That is, abolition, they wanted to abolish, do away with slavery. And more slavery became a moral issue. Is that fair? Well, yes, it is fair, because slavery was a terrible thing, a huge crime against a huge number of people, intolerable, morally indefensible, economically, of course, defensible, morally indefensible. Were these northerners motivated only by morality? No. Some were. Some were saints, I think. They made great sacrifices. But some were greedy men who simply wanted to get some power in the South, probably. I think eventually that's what happened. Okay. The Mexican War we fought from 1846 to 1848, morally indefensible. I think it was a war of pure American greed. We saw a chance to go to war against Mexico, to eventually grab some land cheaply. California, the California territories, Arizona, New Mexico. We won the war, of course. I shouldn't say of course, but we didn't have much of an army then, but we developed one. And Mexico didn't stand a chance, frankly. Mexican War, not nice. Bad. Out of it, though, we paid Mexico some money for huge territories. Arizona territory. Eventually we would get California. Not nice, though. During the 1850s, the abolition movement became more and more powerful. A novel like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which described slavery in very sentimental, very emotional terms, influenced millions of people. The South was on the defensive. It really looked like a civil war was inevitable. Now, what form did the Civil War take? The Civil War took the form of secession, S-E-C-E-S-S-I-O-N. That is, the southern states wanted to secede, cut themselves away from the Union. So the original reason for the war, which began in 1861 to 1865, absolutely necessary dates to know, 1861 to 1865. The original reason for the war was that the South wanted to secede from the North, or from the Union, from the United States. What was behind this? They wanted states' rights. They were tired of the power of Washington, D.C. But morally, the reason for the Civil War was slavery. Our president during the Civil War was Abraham Lincoln, I suppose the greatest single American. Certainly our greatest president. I think most people would agree. Washington has a pretty good claim for that too. But Lincoln was such a moral giant that I think most people would say he's the greatest American of all, and our greatest president as well. As far as I know, I'm no historian, but I believe it. Not a perfect man, of course, but certainly his moral authority was huge. He was a Republican, by the way. Our 16th president. He was re-elected in 1865. Then the war ended, and he was assassinated, as everyone knows. That's another story. Early in the Civil War, very interestingly, the South won many victories. In 1861, in 1862, even in early 1863, the Southern armies were better led, more skillful, fought harder, showed more daring, more courage, more ingenuity than the North. And the North was, the North outnumbered the South always, had better supplies, but the leaders were timid, afraid of what the press would say, afraid of what Washington would say, that is, the president would say. Again and again, the Northern generals lost battles to fewer Southern, to smaller Southern armies. The most famous Southern leader was Robert E. Lee, a genius, a West Point graduate and all that. Most of the leaders were that. But he thought of himself as fighting not for the South, but he was fighting for the Army of Virginia. States' rights, territorial. He was not a Southerner, he was a Virginian. And he led the Army of Virginia, but more and more the Army of Virginia was the leader of the South. And more Robert E. Lee was the leader of the South. Politically, the president of the South was a man named Jefferson Davis. Their capital moved from Virginia down to Mississippi, and the war went on and on. It was a terrible war. Over 600,000 soldiers died. Many other people died too. A brutal, terrible war, as civil wars tend to be the worst, as Koreans know something about that too. War is never pretty, never moral, but our Civil War was a terrible thing, full of cruelty. Heroism, yeah, some kindness, yeah, but terrible cruelty too. Anyway, gradually the numbers of the North gained more and more power. The North's navy blocked the southern coast so that they could not receive supplies. That was a huge advantage for the North, its navy, which again and again outfought the South's much smaller navy. Excuse me a second. Gradually, the tide turned, as we like to say. Gradually, the North started to win more and more battles. The supplies of the South were very limited. Food limited. The Southern soldiers lacked equipment, lacked food, lacked blankets. They were bound to lose. They fought heroically. They were the heroes militarily, I think, of the war. But the size of Northern armies was just too much, and the wealth, the money from the North was too much. Some terrible things happened, more and more terrible things happened, like General Sherman's march through Georgia. We decided that we had to demonstrate to the South that they were going to lose. So General Sherman took a huge army, slashed through Georgia, including Atlanta, burning houses, burning crops, just destroying everything. The South could not survive under conditions like this. Other victories, too. The leader of the North was General Grant, Ulysses Grant, who became our 18th president. and the South surrendered in 1865. General Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, 1865, and the war was over.